During one of our campfires get-together, I heard a few terrifying true stories which I thought I would share with you today. I have changed their names to keep their anonymity, of course. My best friend, Ray's girlfriend, Sarah, has a summer house up in the mountains. That weekend, the 5 of us decided to spend time up there fishing, hunting, basically chilling. On the first night, we gathered around the campfire in the backyard, and as is the norm, we decided to creep each other out with true horror stories that had happened to us or people we knew. Brian kicked off with his story. All right, guys, let me tell you about the night I turned 18. You know, my college friends and I decided to go clubbing to celebrate. We were having an amazing time, music pumping, drinks flowing, everyone dancing. It was one of those nights where everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't. Out of nowhere, Dave, one of my buddies, got into a fight with another group of guys. They were harassing Dave's girl. He decided he had to step up and defend his girl. That's the way it goes, right? It was chaos. 1 minute I was dancing, and the next there were fists flying everywhere. I jumped in, trying to break it up, and then, bam! I took a punch right to the face. Everything went black. When I came to, I was in complete darkness. I thought I was still knocked out, dreaming maybe. I felt something cold and hard against my back, and realized I was lying on a metal surface. I had no clothes on, not a stitch, and there was something covering my head. When I lifted my arm to remove the sheet covering my face, my hand made contact with a hard surface in front of me. I managed to pull the sheet off and realized that the space was tight. There was nowhere to go. I was starting to feel claustrophobic. I was in a drawer, in a morgue. I was having a full-blown anxiety attack and needed to get out of there fast. It felt like I could not get enough oxygen into my lungs. I tried to scream, but my throat was so dry, my voice came out in these weak, raspy gasps. I started banging on the metal walls around me, feeling the cold seep into my skin. I touched the metallic surface in front of me and thought if I pushed downward hard, I could get the drawer I was on to slid open. My hands kept slipping. I could not get any traction. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might stop again. I carried on banging on the side wall, hoping someone would hear it. It felt like forever, but finally I heard someone outside. The drawer slid open. Blinded by the bright light, I raised my hands trying to shield my eyes from the assault on my cornea. I whispered, "Get me out of here," at the shocked morgue attendant who was staring down at me. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Well, in a way, he had. They told me later that I'd been declared dead. No pulse, no signs of life. They thought I was gone. Luckily, my parents had not asked for an autopsy. They'd even started the paperwork to send me to a funeral home. Can you imagine that? If they'd embalmed me, filled me up with that fluid while I was still alive. I shudder to think about it. The doctors ran a bunch of tests afterward. Turns out, my heart had stopped for a brief period and then miraculously started again. They called it a medical mystery. To me, it was the most terrifying experience of my life. One of my mates told me that at the club when I got punched, I had hit my head on a table before falling to the ground. I was given CPR and resuscitated, but my heart apparently had stopped again in the ambulance. Damn, You died 3 times that night." Sarah gasped. Everyone looked shocked and instinctively gave Brian a hug, a slap on the back, and brought him a bottle of beer. "Good to have you with us, buddy," Ling said, raising his beer bottle. The group settled in for the next story. Ling leaned back, took a swig of his beer, and started. "Last year, I took the wife and kids to China to visit my parents. They had just bought a house about 15 minutes out of the city, but close enough for my mom's weekly doctor's appointment. A friend of theirs had helped them find this property, saying it was at a bargain. As soon as you mentioned bargain, you got my mother's attention. The first day, we helped clear out some of the clutters into the front yard. Previous owner had passed away, and her children had long forgotten about her. She was a borderline hoarder. My girls, 12 years old, May, and 9 years old, Dayu, enjoyed playing in the attic with the old toys and games stored in there. At lunchtime, when the kids did not come down, my wife went to fetch them from the attic. They were sitting on the floor, staring at an old wardrobe at the other end of the room. Hey, you two, I have been calling you for 10 minutes now. What is so important that you are ignoring me?" They both got up, hurried down the ladder, and rushed to the kitchen, followed closely by my wife. Unfortunately, we were unable to get the bedrooms ready that day, so we set up the sleeping bags in the living room. Kids were unusually silent and didn't go back up to the attic after lunch. My wife assumed they were sulking after she told them off that afternoon, so we chose to leave them be. Everyone went to sleep. We had 3 sleeping bags. Grandma and Grandpa shared one at the far end of the living room, next to the sliding door. May and Dayu shared one next to us. My wife and I shared the 3rd sleeping bag. We were closer to the door, which led towards the corridor, and the kitchen was right across from the living room. There was a faint light coming into the room through the window, which was overlooking the front yard. I should really give you guys an idea of the layout of the house. The house was on 3 floors. When you entered the front door, you would see the door to the kitchen on the left and the door to the living room on the right. Straight in front of you, right at the end of the corridor, was the stairs. Next to the stairs was the guest toilet. And underneath the staircase was the door to the basement. On the first floor, there were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. On the second floor, there was the master bedroom and ensuite bathroom. The entrance to the attic was located at the top of the stairs. You had to pull a string to get the trap door to open and pull the ladder down. Both the kitchen and the living room had a door leading into the back garden. In the middle of the night, I felt a hand on my arm. Startled, I turned to find my eldest daughter, May, staring at me. I was about to talk when she slapped the hand over my mouth and put her finger over her mouth, mouthing shh. Confused, I looked over at my wife. She was fast asleep. I turned back at May, ready to chastise her, to quit playing games, when I realized she was pointing at something. I followed her fingers, which was pointing towards the front door. It was wide open. I know it was closed and locked before we went to bed. I had checked the house and locked all the doors before we went to bed. Before I could move or say anything, I noticed a shadow in the doorway. The moon was casting enough light for me to see movement as someone crawled slowly on all fours through the doorway, carrying something in its hand, and walked down the corridor towards the stairs. It was wearing rags, was nearly skeletal, its bony arms hardly holding its weight. It had long black hair falling to the floor, trailing behind as it crawled slowly on all fours. It seemed to be unaware of our presence. I froze in horror, terrified, and I couldn't believe what I just saw. My daughter shook my arm, snapping me back to my senses. Everyone was still fast asleep, and I could hear whatever I saw walking up the stairs as the floorboards creaked under its weight. We sat there in silence as it made its way back up to the attic. We hadn't closed the attic door when the girls went down for lunch, and no one had gone back upstairs. I woke up my wife and my parents, explaining what we saw, and said we had to quietly go to the car. We were not going to spend the night with that thing in the house. My wife took the car keys and helped my parents to the car with May. I grabbed our bags with the essentials and went to pick Dayu up with my free arm. She wrapped her arms around my neck, and as I turned, I saw something blocking the doorway. In the semi-darkness, I could make out the outline of the thing I saw earlier. It sat completely still. I felt it was looking at me, though I could not see its eyes. Dayu turned around and saw it. She let out a deafening scream, grabbed my neck tightly, cutting my air supply, and buried her head into my neck, still screaming. Amidst the chaos, I saw it lunge at me, and it latched onto Dayu, pulling her off me. The speed and strength it had surprised me, and before I could react, it had turned around and was running like a gorilla with Dayu over its shoulder. I dropped everything and started chasing it, but before I got to the door, I heard a loud crack. As I reached the door, I saw my wife holding a hysterical Dayu in her arms, and the thing was lying motionless on the floor with dark stains forming around its neck. There was a shovel lying on the floor next to it. My parents were on the phone with authorities and called for an ambulance. The thing was actually a very emaciated middle-aged woman with a humpback, a twisted spine. My wife was on her way back to the house to see what was taking me so long when she heard Dayu scream. She picked up the first thing she saw, which was a shovel, and ran into the house, only to see the thing was carrying a screaming Dayu over its shoulder. Without thinking, she swung the shovel hard, knocking it to the ground. We drove back to my parents' old flat and spent the night there. The next day, the authorities had gotten into contact with the previous owner's children, and they explained they had a sibling, Wei, who had learning and physical disabilities. Turns out their mother was looking after Wei, and after her passing, none of her 4 siblings wanted to take responsibility for her. So, they left her alone in the house. After a few years, they thought Wei would be gone by now, since there was no one to feed or care for her. When the estate agent did not mention anything about a body or smell, they chose to keep it to themselves and thought the next owner can deal with that once they moved in. It seemed that Wei got scared every time strangers came into the house, and she would hide in the attic. When the girls were playing in the attic that afternoon, she was hiding in the old wardrobe, watching them through the cracks. When my wife called out to the girls for lunch that afternoon, Wei slowly opened the wardrobe door, which made a loud creaking sound, and the girls froze in place staring at the slightly opened wardrobe door. Their mother was already in the attic telling them off. The girls did not want to be there anymore and ran down to the kitchen. They were not sure what happened and did not speak of it. Well, until May heard the front door open and saw something crawl on all 4s to the front garden. It was rummaging through the pile of rubbish we had thrown out. We went back to the house. The police officers had already cleared the house by then. I wanted to know what was it that Wei wanted from the front garden that she had to come out from her hiding spot in the middle of the night. The attic was as I remember it. I walked over to the wardrobe, which was wide open now. There were blankets, pillows, and a dirty old doll. I remember I had found this on the staircase yesterday and threw it out. My wife and I visited Wei at the hospital. She was in an induced coma to help with her head injury, and the doctors said in her medical records Wei had developmental and learning disability. She had the mindset of a 10-year-old. This broke my wife's heart because it all made sense. Wei wanted her toy and Dayu to play with. She must have been very lonely, left all alone in that house. The siblings agreed to use the proceeds from the house sale to pay for Wei's care. My wife washed Wei's doll, bought a few others she thought Wei would like, and gave it to the staff at the hospital to hold for her. We still get updates on Wei. She is thriving and doing much better. I cannot believe those greedy shits. Leaving a kid for all intent and purpose, she is a kid, all alone, to die. Horrible. Heartless. We all nodded in agreement. Hugh stood up, stretched, and then looked at Sarah. You would love this story. You are into this astrology and magic things, aren't you? He asked. Sarah showed him the finger, and Ray kicked his foot in the air, growling, "Get on with it." Hugh chuckled and sat back down, running his fingers through his hair. My twin sister, Liz, was into these mumbo-jumbos as well, he started. Hey, Sarah protested. Liz was 22 and had graduated in finance that year. Both Liz and her friends would regularly go to this palm reader for predictions on love or their exams. Basically, it was taking over their lives. Mom thought it was funny. It was harmless fun, and Liz would get over it once she met someone. A new circus came to town. Liz and her mates beelined straight to the palm reader. The tent was adorned with colorful fairy lights. Sandalwood sticks were burning in a corner, and there were sparkling bead curtains at the entrance and the windows. Colorful curtains draped from ceiling to floor, giving the tent a gypsy-ish look. The middle-aged woman was sitting at a table in the middle of the room. She was wearing a two-piece costume showing off her slim figure and exposed tan abs. I had accompanied my sister to the circus and waited outside the tent for them to finish. The woman laid out some cards, and my sister chose 3, and the woman slowly smiled and said, "Well, Liz, you have chosen romance. The cards say you will be meeting someone special soon." She paused and then said, "You will meet in a supermarket, and his dog will approach you first. Then the great love story begins." You got all this from the cards? Up to where I was going to meet him? Liz asked, stupefied. Of course, these are not set in stone, and I see this clearly, but you could also meet at a car wash. But meet you will. She finished with a flourish. For the first time, Liz looked weirded out and left saying the woman was strange. We kept teasing her the whole night about meeting her future love, man in shining armor. The following week, Liz had started her new job. That evening, Mom needed some stuff from the supermarket for dinner. So, she texted Liz to pick them up on her way home. Liz said she was going to be home in 20 minutes. 45 minutes later, Mom called her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. This raised alarm bells, and Mom thought Liz got into a car accident. She drove to the supermarket, but the road was clear. So, she checked with the police station if there were any car accidents on the road between the supermarket and her house. There was nothing about a car accident or of any incidents. At this point, we had all tried calling Liz's phone, but it was switched off. Not wanting to report her missing just yet, Mom decided to ask the supermarket to see the CCTV camera instead. The store manager sympathized, and luckily, he agreed to check the cameras. Around 5:30, Liz's car pulled into the car park, and a few seconds later, a white van pulled in and parked right next to her car. As Liz made her way inside the supermarket, a man with a black Labrador got off the white van and followed her inside. 5 minutes later, he went back outside and stood by the door, smoking a cigarette. When Liz came out, the black Labrador playfully ran towards Liz and started jumping on her. The man approached her and seemed to be apologizing and pulled the dog off her. They started talking. As Liz walked to her car, the man casually walked alongside her, and as Liz was unlocking her car, the van door slid open, startling Liz, who instinctively backed away. But the man grabbed her from behind, covering her mouth, and shoved her into the van. Another man came out of the van, got into Liz's car, and both van and car took off. All of this took less than 5 minutes, and Liz was gone. Mom was in tears and inconsolable. The man did not buy anything in the store, so there was no car details or fingerprints to work on. The van license was fake and untraceable. The camera image was grainy, and the police officers tried to search based on the camera image, but that was not producing anything either. I remembered the palm reader or tarot reader, whichever that was, and the story she had given Liz about a man and dog at a supermarket. The circus was about to leave town that day, but the police officers were able to get a warrant to search their property. They found Liz and 2 other girls tied and hidden away in a false compartment inside a trailer. The canine dogs had Liz's scent from her clothes. My mom had given to the police, and after an hour, they found the girls. As it happens, the gypsy woman would pick out women who came for tarot reading for her accomplices to kidnap. It was unclear what they intended to do, or if this was the first time they did this. None of the people involved were talking. The general assumption was that, by saying they will meet a love interest with his dog, the women will lower their guards when a man matching that description approached them out of the blue. Liz did let her guard down, and for a moment, she thought the gypsy woman was right. The man was charming and was easy to talk to. After she had walked out of the supermarket, the black Labrador suddenly started jumping on her. On hindsight, he must have trained the dog to do that on command. He apologized and pointed to a random SUV parked a few cars from hers, indicating that it was his car, as he walked alongside her. He offered to take her out to coffee or dinner to make up for his naughty dog. Liz said she will think about it. The next thing she knew, she was being dragged into the van and they injected her with something to stop her from fighting. She woke up inside the trailer with the other girls. They were severely dehydrated inside the hot trailer compartment with no access to water. Liz has made a full recovery physically. She suffers from PTSD and hardly leaves the house. This happened 6 years ago. She has an 18-month-old baby, and her husband is great at bringing her out of her comfort zone. I met Liz. She looked fine. You made up the story, didn't you? Sarah looked at Hugh dubiously. Not even a little bit, Hugh replied, staring at her seriously. You met her last year. How long did she stay at my wedding reception? Did you see her when everyone was sending me and my wife off to our honeymoon? No, because she left after the dance and cake cutting. You dared Sarah to call him a liar. Okay, I believe you. Sarah threw up her hands. Then, on a more serious note, I am sorry. I am glad Liz is doing well and has a great support system. Ray clapped his hand and said, Me next. Now, remember this happened when I was a teenager, and I was an absolute twat back then, Ray said. Back then? You were worse than now? Ling whistled in fake disbelief. "Oh, why don't you ask your wife what she thought of me back then?" Ray winked at Ling. He turned and saw the look Sarah was giving him. The group snickered as Ray squirmed in a seat under Sarah's glare. He cleared his throat and started with his story. "There were these trends among my friends to break into abandoned mansions, hotels, hospitals, and other dilapidated buildings to make videos. They would pretend the place was haunted, scare each other and the viewers. We did not have any boundaries and were high on testosterone, among other things. There was this lab that was abandoned, and there was a rumor that they did human experiments in there. The death counts were unknown, but it was common knowledge the place was haunted and very spooky. Great for video contents. That night, we went past the no trespassing sign and slipped into the building through the basement window. Luke was the cameraman. Paul was the security. He was built like a truck. And I was the producer. I would come up with ideas and how to make the content more appealing. We were exploring each floor and catching everything on camera as we went along. I guess there was an element of truth to the story. There were gurneys, and some part of the building looked like a hospital. If they did animal testing, we did not find any animal cage where these supposed animal trials were being conducted. We even found a teddy bear, which indicated that a child at some point had stayed there. While we were talking, we heard a noise in the corridor like someone had kicked an empty can, and it went skidding across the concrete floor before coming to a stop. Thinking it was security, we stopped talking, switched off the torches, and looked towards the door, expecting to see security walk by. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw movement by the door, and then Luke started screaming. We switched the torches back on. There was a man on top of Luke chewing on his cheek and making these strange growling noises. Paul snapped into action, grabbed the man by the neck, and forced open his jaw, releasing Luke, who was still screaming in agony. I called the police and reported the incident. We could not leave this man here to attack someone else. The guy was a homeless man and had bought cheap substance on the street. Whatever he had consumed had driven him to cannibalize Luke. Thanks to Paul's quick action, Luke barely has any mark on his face. Strangely, Luke barely remembered the event the next day. Doctors believed he was so traumatized by the event, his mind had created a partition in his brain effectively shielding him from that memory, to put it in layman's term. I always wondered how the man could see in the dark because he went straight for Luke in pitch darkness. Anyways, that's my scary experience. "I guess that leaves me," Sarah said. "When I was 11, my dad bought this gorgeous 7-bedroom house near a nature preserve. I loved to camp, and we would regularly hike and camp a few days at a time. After a few years, I started hiking and exploring the forest by myself. I was 16 when I had planned to hike for 5 days, and had given the housekeeper the address where to pick me up on the 5th day at noon. By then, both my parents were hardly home. They were constantly traveling, and when they were home, they were always on their phone. Rich girl problems, right? So, the housekeeper was my guardian in the absence of my parents, and I feel sorry for her. I gave her so much grief, and my teenage years were particularly brutal. On my 3rd day hiking, I had covered a lot of ground and arrived by the lake earlier than scheduled. I decided to spend the rest of the afternoon swimming in the lake and enjoy the stunning views. Around 4 in the afternoon, I was floating in the lake, staring at the clear blue sky when I felt I was being watched. You know the feeling, right? I instinctively looked towards my campsite. There was someone standing by the tree line, motionless. It looked like a man in his 40s, maybe. He turned and walked into my campsite and out of sight. I could not see what he was doing. I swam back and quickly got dressed. I had a bear spray, which I always carried wherever I went. Back at the campsite, everything looked untouched. The food was still hanging on a tree branch where I'd left it. There was no one inside my tent, and all my equipment were where I'd left them. I wondered for a moment if I had imagined things. My relief lasted for a minute. I found large boot prints from the lake up to the campsite. Whoever he was did not enter the campsite. The boot prints circled around the campsite. Sunset was in 2 hours, and I wondered if I should find another place to camp or stay put. I decided to stay put. If I walked another hour or so, he might still follow me. It made no difference to the situation at all. After dinner, I kept the fire going and listened for any sounds. At around 10 p.m., I had decided that the man must have moved on, and he was not coming back. I woke up in the middle of the night. Everything was strangely silent outside. No crickets or owls. I did not make any sound and just listened. Then, click, the sound was familiar, like a gun cocking. I looked on the ground next to me where I'd left my gun. It was gone. Someone had come into my tent and took my gun. My knife was under my pillow, and it was still there. I didn't move or make a sound. I stayed like this until morning. When I stepped out of the tent around 7 a.m., the sun was out, and I could see boot prints all over the place. He came into my tent and watched me sleep. I packed everything up and decided to run and cover as much ground as possible. I did not want to spend another night camping. Even as night fell, I carried on running until I'd reached the entrance to the nature preserve at around 8 in the evening. There were a few cars and trailers parked there. I asked if I could stay with them until my housekeeper was able to pick me up. Rosita was an angel. She arrived within the hour and took me home. She called the police so I can make a statement and declared my gun stolen. I never went back out hiking or camping ever since. Why didn't you tell me this? Ray asked angrily. I have been hounding you to go hiking with me all this time, and this is why you always declined? I would have understood. Ray was horrified. It felt right to share it today, by the campfire, she said simply. So do you still go to that house? Asked Ling. Yes, you are staying in it. Sarah pointed to the house. We all stared at the forest next to the house and wondered if the man was still around a decade later. Is he still watching her from the forest?